E. coli traced with BG means just a mixture of E. coli and Bacillus globigii, and the reason that those two bacteria were used were, first of all, Bacillus globigii forms very, very stable, tough spores, and that is used to simulate the behavior of anthrax, Bacillus anthracis, the anthrax bacterium. Anthrax is, of course, a very well-known germ warfare agent, and it is very, very stable, very tough, survives. Whereas E. coli is a much more delicate organism and is more typical of most of the other bacteria that might be used as germ warfare agents, like, for example, plague.
Professor Spratt concluded that the overwhelming majority of people in Dorset are likely to have suffered health problems. But those who are susceptible to disease, for example people with chest infections, may have been more at risk. He could find no link with clusters of birth defects, miscarriages and learning disabilities found at nearby East Lulworth. A Porton spokesman says as the threat is very different now from 50 years ago, they can foresee no future need for such studies. After decades of secrecy, mystery still surrounds exactly who authorised these tests in populated areas. Porton's own field trials document admits there's a paucity of information, and in many instances authority for these tests came only from within Porton. This memo, written by the chief scientist in 1963, admits if the trials were made public, it would be politically embarrassing. The matter of authority is, according to declassified documents, now almost impossible to trace.
It's very interesting that they were able to write these documents that this had better not get out because it will be politically embarrassing. That shows that they do not expect those documents to be read, whereas now those in government are much more canny about the probability of documents being read and are much more cautious about how they operate.
In the next programme, how sprayings over public areas continued into the 70s. And as the threat of bioterrorism rears its head again, we reveal exclusive details of further anthrax tests.
Well, what worries me is that we're starting to repeat experiments that were done 50 years ago. We're going in a circle yet again.
You might be forgiven for thinking this is a 60s holiday camp. It's not. It's lunchtime at the government's top secret biological and chemical research centre at Porton Down in Wiltshire. At the height of the Cold War, public anxiety grew about the goings-on at Porton. In an attempt to allay public fears, this propaganda film was released.
Although television and newspaper cameramen have spent many hours in MRE, they almost always only represent the work carried out here by this.
Yet this glossy image hides a sinister tale of secrecy at the highest levels of power. The West was being used as a vast testing ground for Porton's biological warfare research programme.
It's, I think, inconceivable that that would be done now, but times were very different then. I think that the Cold War was very much in people's minds, and there was a concern that the UK was particularly vulnerable to a germ warfare attack from an aeroplane going down the coast or from a ship offshore. And they really wanted to understand something about how the bacteria spread and what the extent of the threat was. And was it just going to be people in a very small area, or would in fact people over the whole of the south of England be potentially at risk of being infected with a germ warfare agent?
A huge test programme was carried out by Porton Down scientists, sanctioned by government. One series was carried out in the 1960s off the Dorset coast near Weymouth. Two types of bacteria were sprayed from a modified ship, the Ice Whale. One, known as Bacillus globigii, or BG, simulated anthrax. The other was E. coli.
If you got close to the ship, you'd be able to see the mist, but away from it you wouldn't be able to see at all. The spraying was done always at night, because otherwise the sunlight would have killed the E. coli. The BG was in spore form, so the sunlight wouldn't kill that. That was almost sort of armour plated. So all the attacks, and that's what they were simulated attacks, occurred at night.
Of course, the state in a democracy is meant to serve the people rather than the people serve the state. And we have more democratic political culture now that allows the kind of questions that you're asking to be asked. And when there's no transparency, when there's no accountability, then people in these situations find it very tempting to abuse their power and simply assume that they know best.
It's pretty obvious that we do need to know how to defend the country. I have no problem with that whatsoever. I do have a problem with experiments being carried out in public areas without public knowledge, with no independent safety oversight.
As the 60s ended, Porton Down's testing programme became more ambitious and spread from sea to air.
After they'd done the experiments of the large-scale releases from the ice whale, they wanted to scale those up, and they had a Canberra bomber which they modified so it would hold very large amounts of bacteria, up to about 1,000 gallons, and would spray that from the aeroplane as it flew low across part of the UK.
Throughout 1967, the dual-purpose bomber used as its target RAF Tarrant Rushden in Dorset. Yet the bacteria being sprayed would have been carried some 50 miles on the wind towards Somerset.
I don't think they were any different from the experiments from the ice whale, because they were using the same bacteria, the E. coli mixed with the Bacillus clavigii, and the amounts that were released were similar to the amounts from the ice whale, although they did intend from the documents to build up to larger releases.
In the late 90s, Professor Brian Spratt, now based at Imperial College in London, was asked by the Defence Ministry to independently review the potential health implications of spreading bacteria over populated areas.
Well, I was really looking at the experiments from about the early 60s through to the mid-70s, and I was given access to all of the scientific reports that had been released under the 30-year rule, and a couple of documents which were still at that time classified, which were the sort of the basic laboratory internal laboratory reports about these experiments that were carried out in the south of England, spraying the bacteria across the Dorset coast, and a few other experiments that were carried out.
The report focused on all trials carried out by Porton Down from the 60s to the mid-70s. It concluded that on the whole the tests were safe, although it did add that some people suffering from chronic illness could have been infected. These people would have been unaware of the secret military activities in the area.
Nobody knew about these, but these were very secret, and so certainly if there had been a small cluster of cases of pneumonia, for example, then they certainly wouldn't have been picked up, because everyone gets pneumonia. Well, not everyone, but pneumonia is a relatively common disease, and so doctors would not, I think, have known that anything odd was going on. So I think that's one of the interesting things, that these releases were done on a public that were completely unwittingly exposed to these agents, and something I think we wouldn't contemplate doing, the MOD wouldn't contemplate doing now, but at the time it was considered to be justified.
Justified or not, the report did highlight some concerns over safety. It stated that 4 of the trials were even more risky.
There were a couple of batches which had a rather higher level of contamination, and they were still used. They were put into mice, they didn't kill the mice, and so the contamination was not thought to be important. I did think it was slightly odd that they did decide to spray those particular suspensions, given they had a significant level of contamination with bacteria that weren't very well characterized.
Recently, ITV West obtained previously classified documents from the Public Records Office. These detailed 6 secret trials carried out in 1968. Although this time was covered by Professor Spratt's report, he says he had no knowledge of them before we showed him the documents. Was he, like the public, being kept in the dark?
I'm surprised to hear that, because I did try and get hold of all the documents, and I think if the MOD is going to go to all the trouble of having an independent report, they should show me all the documents. I think just to try and sort of hide them and not even tell me of their existence, I think is not a very sensible way to behave.
The papers relate to a unique set of tests, which were different because they served no scientific purpose. Porton's intention was purely to show off its capabilities to representatives of the armed forces.